Okay, so we're going to review Module 6. So when it comes to the settlement plan forms, groups of 5 and community sponsors have a combined undertaking and settlement plan form. So the settlement plan is included within their undertaking form. But when it comes to sponsorship agreement holders, they have separate forms for their undertaking and their settlement plan. And when it comes to groups of 5 and community sponsors, they must prove their financial capacity when they submit every single application. Whereas the sponsorship agreement holders are not required to prove their financial capacity because that has already been determined when they were approved to become a sponsorship agreement holder. Now, when it comes to sponsorship agreement holders, if you are a new sponsorship agreement holder and your agreement is less than 2 years old, you will have to submit your settlement plans for those first 2 years while you're a SAW. After that, you will not be required to submit the settlement plan with your applications. But keep in mind, just because you don't have to submit it does not mean that you don't have to complete it and fill it out. Every sponsoring group, whether you're a group of 5, sponsorship agreement holder, or one of their constituent groups, or community sponsors, each of you always has to fill out a settlement plan form. The sponsorship agreement holders, however, are exempt from having to submit that sponsorship form. But IRCC may ask for it at any time, and you must be able to produce it whenever they're asking you to. A big part of settlement planning is calculating the cost of sponsorship and for the sponsoring group to understand how much money they're legally liable to provide as financial support to the refugees at the time of arrival. So at the time of application, groups of 5 and community sponsor groups will be evaluated on their financial capacity to ensure that in general, they can meet the cost of sponsorship. This is why the sponsorship cost tables are used when preparing the application. Sponsorship agreement holders evaluate their CGs and co-sponsors themselves, since the SAW is ultimately responsible for determining the financial risk. At the time of arrival, sponsoring groups are required to use the prevailing RAP rates. So prevailing means the current RAP rates for calculating their legal liability amounts. And this applies to every group type, whether you're a group of 5, community sponsor, or a sponsorship agreement holder, or one of their CGs. You all have to use the prevailing RAP rates at the time of arrival. You no longer refer to what you had calculated at the time of application if you are a group of 5 or community sponsor. You now have to do a recalculation using the RAP rates. And we go into more in depth about RAP rates and calculating the legal liability amounts for the cost of sponsorship in the course that follows this introductory course. So the advanced level course, IET101, we go through a little bit more in-depth knowledge about the financial responsibilities. So when you're calculating the cost of sponsorship, as you recall from the module, there are two factors which will impact calculating the cost. The first is the family size and composition. So we're taking a look at the ages and stages of life and living situations of the family, as well as the number of people in that family, because that'll change the cost of sponsorship. So when we look at school-age minor children under 18, those individuals who have children under 18 years old that are of school age receive a little bit more money than those families who don't have children that are school-aged. And anybody who has a dependent child who is between 18 and 21, those individuals have to calculate their children separately who are over 18 years old, because in Canada, you're considered an adult, the age of majority. In general, across the country, it's 18. Some places it's 19, but to make it easy, IRCC says 18 across the board. As soon as they turn 18, you have to separate out and calculate them separately from the rest of the family for receiving their own funds for sponsorship. And there will be a difference in cost, whether you're married or single, and whether or not you have accompanying family members at the time that they arrive, or whether there are family members that will arrive at a later date under the 1-year window. And there will also be a difference depending on whether the arrived refugees will live with signatories to the undertaking. So whether they are living with their sponsors or not. The second main thing we're looking at when calculating cost of sponsorship are the specific needs of individuals in the family. So you want to anticipate or update the settlement plan when a specific need is identified. Is there anybody who has a disability or a medical condition? Are there any new pregnancies? Has anybody gone missing or is deceased? Are there any new marriages, births, or adoptions? Or has any secondary migration taken place? When those things occur, you have to revisit the settlement plan and the cost of sponsorship. So the settlement plan requires sponsors to name specific people who have been assigned to carry out the various settlement responsibilities, such as meeting at the airport, transportation, teaching the newcomers how to get around using public transport, housing, looking for affordable housing and finding furnishings, arranging for interpreter services, applying for the SIN number or the Canada Child Benefit and things like that, arranging for medical appointments and dental appointments, giving an orientation, so helping to teach the newcomers about budgeting, shopping, and public transportation. And someone who will help them register for English or French as a second language, registering children for daycare or for school, and being connected with the settlement services. So for groups of 5, assigning the responsibilities is done on the undertaking document, the section which looks like this. And you'll see it's asking the question, which group member will be responsible? And so you should be looking at all of the people who have signed the undertaking document. Each of those persons should be participating in these settlement activities. One person alone should not be responsible for all of the settlement assistance being provided. And you can actually name more than one person in that column, which group member will be responsible. So for example, arranging transportation for the refugees to and from appointments and activities. You can list more than one person there, but as a minimum, you have to be listing the people who are signing the undertaking document. So each of those groups of 5 people or more, if they've signed the undertaking, their names should be here somewhere, but you can divide up the responsibilities for sure. When it comes to community sponsors, their settlement plan looks very similar. However, there's a column for co-sponsors because community sponsors can work with co-sponsors. And again, they're going to identify which signatory is responsible for each aspect of the settlement activities. So it can either be the community sponsor representative, so that's the first column, sponsor, or it could be the co-sponsor or both. And you'll see you've got 2 columns for co-sponsor. So you may have more than one co-sponsor. And so you can put check mark next to meet the refugees at the airport. You can say that the sponsor and both co-sponsors will be doing that. Or you can select just one person to be responsible for one of these activities. But again, you are not leaving everything up to one single person to do all of these things. Remember, sponsorship is a group undertaking. Now, when it comes to sponsorship agreement holders, your settlement plan looks like this. You have a column for the sponsorship agreement holder, a column for the the constituent group, and for the co-sponsor. Now, those additional 2 columns are only if it's applicable. If you are a sponsorship agreement holder that doesn't work with co-sponsors or constituent groups, then of course you're going to check mark each of these boxes under the SAW column. But if you are working with a CG and or a co-sponsor, you will check mark the responsibilities for them as appropriate. Now, when it comes to filling out the settlement plan form, many sponsorship agreement holders actually find that the space provided is not sufficient for explaining how the sponsorship activities and responsibilities will be provided. So some SAWs have created a detailed settlement plan, and quite often sponsorship agreement holders will require their CGs and co-sponsors to sign a memorandum of understanding, which outlines their responsibilities separately. And when it comes to financial assessments, within each sponsorship group type, whether you're a group of 5 community sponsor or a SAW, you must ensure that you have sufficient funds in place for the cost of sponsorship at the time of arrival. You learned in chapter 1 of this module that the SAW is ultimately responsible for any sponsorship submitted under their agreement. And as such, each SAW should have a process in place to do a financial assessment of any constituent group or co-sponsor who is contributing funds to the sponsorship. But when it comes to community sponsors, the same is true. They are ultimately responsible for any sponsorships they submit as an organization, even if they work with co-sponsors who agree to fully fund the cost of settlement. When it comes to community sponsor groups and groups of 5, each person who individually contributes funds from their personal income will undergo a financial assessment by IRCC. And the financial assessment uses a simple formula to determine if the financial contributor has sufficient surplus funds. So this formula that IRCC uses, in fact, will be helpful for a sponsorship agreement holder to use when they work with co-sponsors or their constituent groups who are contributing financially, especially if those funds come from the individual's own employment earnings. IRCC takes a look at the individual contributor's gross income. They subtract from that the cost of living for the contributor's family, and then they subtract from that the cost of any other sponsorship commitments. And this leaves the amount that that particular individual can contribute towards the cost of sponsorship. Once the individual's financial capacity has been determined using that formula, then IRCC will take a look at the overall contributions by each person contributing funds, and they will assess whether the sponsoring group as a whole has the financial capacity. So again, they take a look at the individual contributors first, and then they take a look at all of the contributors as a whole together as a group to see if they have the financial capacity. And I'm going to go through a quick demonstration of this formula for you right now. So one of the proof documents that you have to provide when you are a financial contributor to a sponsorship is the notice of assessment form that you receive from Canada Revenue Agency. And this is proving how much income you have received in the previous year. So you're basically saying to IRCC, I have earned a certain amount of money, and this proves how much money I earned in that particular year. So on this form, we have line 15000. It used to be called line 150. They've added a few zeros. So this is your total income. This is the amount of income that you received before any taxes were deducted. And for this individual, it was $13,030. So a closer look at this gross income, $13,030, that came from line 15000. So next we have to take a look at how much does it cost for this financial contributor to support their own family. So this is a single individual, they have no dependents. So IRCC is going to look at family size 1. They require $16,500 to meet as a minimum their own cost of living for themselves. This is how much IRCC says they need for themselves to live on here in Canada. And they use the cost tables for determining this amount. And so if you were a couple, they would look at family size 2, and it would be $24,800 for a family size of 2. But this is for the individual, it's $16,500. So now let's take a look at the formula. How much money can this particular individual contribute according to IRCC's formula? Well, we take a look at the notice of assessment amount, and that amount was $13,030. We subtract from that the sponsorship cost table amount for their own family size. So this is an individual, so we have to subtract $16,500 from their earnings. And then we have to take a look at if they have contributed funds to any other sponsorships, then we subtract the amount that they have agreed to contribute. So in this particular case, this individual actually does not earn enough money to support themselves at the basic minimum level to live in Canada. So right now they have a shortfall of $3,470 to even meet their own basic financial needs to support themselves. So they would be refused, in this case by IRCC, as not being able to be a financial contributor. Now let's take a look at a married couple. So let's say that the notice of assessment from a married couple came out to be $38,053 from one person who is working in this family. The sponsorship cost table says that they need to have, as a couple, $24,800 to live on, to look after their own financial basic needs. And this particular couple has previously been approved and agreed to provide $10,000 for a different sponsorship. So when we subtract $24,800 and $10,000 from $38,053, we are left with $3,253. So in this case, for this couple, they could not agree to say they're going to provide $5,000 to a new sponsorship because IRCC would look at this formula and say, you don't have $5,000 to contribute, even if it's in their bank account, because they're saying that they're going to provide the money based on their employment income. And based on this formula, IRCC says your employment income, you don't earn that money, even though it's in your bank account and you have $5,000 there. They are saying that this formula tells me you don't have enough. So that's where it gets tricky. You have to be able to prove that the money is in the account already and that it is going to be designated for that specific sponsorship and not used as an emergency for something else if it comes up. So when it comes to sponsors' responsibilities, generally speaking, your role as a sponsor is to provide both settlement and non-financial settlement support to the refugees that you've sponsored for the first 12 months after the date of arrival. And this includes, when we talk about the financial responsibilities, startup funds, which is a one-time amount that is given to the newcomers when they arrived to purchase things like furniture or clothing or food, things like that. You're also responsible to provide regular monthly financial support. So the newcomers, they should be expecting on a monthly basis as a minimum some funds in their bank account from you as the sponsor. You cannot say, I'm not going to give them any money. I'll provide everything they need. They don't need money because I will give them what they need. I'll take them where they need to go. That can't happen. As a minimum, they have to have a basic financial support amount being provided to them. Yes, you can make deductions based on in-kind donations, things that you're giving at no cost, but they will still be required to receive money from you. You can't reduce the full cost of sponsorship to zero. And these amounts are based on the minimum RAP financial support, which is outlined in the specific provincial RAP rate tables and the startup cost table located on the RSTP website under the Responsibilities tab or menu item. And here are a few things to keep in mind that's also part of your responsibility. So sponsoring groups will not profit financially. So you cannot earn a profit by doing refugee sponsorship. And this in particular applies to any sponsorship agreement holders who might be a for-profit organization. The activities of private sponsorship that you undertake as a SAW, that is a for-profit business, those profits cannot be generated based on doing private sponsorship. So your private sponsorship activities need to be a humanitarian and charitable act. And you cannot accept funds from the refugees for any of these situations that I'm going to mention, either before or after the refugees arrive in Canada. So you can't accept funds as a payment for submitting a sponsorship or as a prepayment or repayment for lodging, care, and settlement assistance. And you cannot accept funds from the refugees as a deposit to guarantee that the refugees will stay with the sponsor for 1 year after they arrive. Any of those things cannot be done as they are considered to be illegal. And sponsors themselves cannot act as paid representatives for the refugees. So you should not be receiving any money from the refugee to act on their behalf with the government of Canada. And you should not require that refugees, their relatives, or friends use the services of a paid representative for the purpose of submitting the sponsorship application, because filling out the application form is free. You should not require that they have to pay somebody to do that. It can be their choice, but it should not be a requirement. And you cannot charge an administrative fee to the refugees. Sponsorship agreement holders do have an administrative fee that they can charge for sponsoring groups like a family link or a constituent group, but they cannot require that administrative fee be charged to the refugees in turn. And sponsoring groups are not responsible for covering the costs of the refugee's immigration loan or any debt that the arrived refugee occurs in Canada unless you have co-signed those loans with them. Sponsors are highly recommended to read through the financial guidelines for the applicable guide to sponsor based on your sponsorship group type. So they're listed here for SAWs, it's guide 5413. For groups of 5, it's guide 2200. And for community sponsors, it's guide 2201. And in each of them, the financial guidelines are located in Appendix A. And sponsors are also expected to refer to the post-arrival frequently asked questions document on how the RAP rate policies are to be interpreted. So in particular, if the arrived newcomers are going to be living with their sponsors, or if they're going to be sharing accommodations, then you will want to refer to these post-arrival frequently asked questions to understand how you can make any deductions and apply them in those kinds of situations. So when you apply financial support deductions, there are some deductions that may be applied to reduce the cost of sponsorship. So you have personal assets at the time of arrival, such as any funds they brought with them to Canada, or if the newcomer receives money from selling a vehicle or property. There's also household income deductions through employment or qualifying federal benefits, such as the CRB. I do want to point out, however, that the Canada Child Care benefit cannot be used to reduce the cost of sponsorship. But things like donations, such as gifts in kind for housing, clothing, furniture, or basic needs, can be deducted. So when it comes to personal assets, arrived refugees may have money or assets which they intend to sell at the time of arrival. So where possible, newcomers can be provided with opportunities for self-support. And when the sponsored person voluntarily discloses their assets, their sponsors can determine if the personal amounts qualifies for a reduction in the settlement support that they are providing. And IRCC has a document available for download on the RSTP website, which can help sponsors and newcomers with making a declaration of personal assets. And keep in mind, there's a minimum amount that the newcomers can actually keep from their personal assets. And there's a chart you'll notice in the course materials that you would be referring to. When it comes to household income deductions, sponsored persons can earn up to 50% of their net settlement support entitlement before any reductions to settlement support can be applied. So for example, if sponsors are providing $1,000 per month, the newcomer can earn up to $1,500 net income before sponsors can reduce the cost of sponsorship dollar for dollar. And please note, any dependent children who are of employment age and have a part-time income when they're enrolled in school, that income cannot be used as part of the household income deductions. Newcomer refugees may become financially self-sufficient during the sponsorship year of settlement. However, sponsors must still provide non-financial settlement assistance until the end of the sponsorship period, and they must be prepared to resume financial support if refugees no longer financially self-sufficient during the sponsorship period. So if they lost their job, you must resume providing financial support. And a quick note about one-year window support. When signing the undertaking document, you're agreeing to provide financial support not only for the principal applicant, but also for any dependents that come to Canada with them or any non-accompanying family members that arrive under the one-year window of opportunity, even if it's several years later. You have to determine whether the original principal applicant is self-sufficient enough to be able to provide for their family members when they arrive. And if they aren't, you are responsible as the sponsoring group to provide that financial amount for the 12 months after the date of arrival. When it comes to in-kind donated items, while the cost of sponsorship may be offset when in-kind items are donated, the cost of sponsorship, as I mentioned, cannot be fully reduced by donations. The sponsored household shall receive a baseline amount based on the minimum rates and any allowable in-kind deduction percentages. And a note to groups of 5 and community sponsor groups, upon arrival, the allowable percentages table for in-kind deductions can be found under the SAW Guide to Sponsorship or on the RSTP's minimum financial support calculator. You could make in-kind deductions based on whether or not they're receiving their housing at no cost, if you've provided any clothing at no cost or furnishings at no cost. Or perhaps you have stocked the pantry with some items before they have arrived. If you've done any of those things, just make sure you properly document your proof of providing this support. So receipts for things that you've purchased ahead of time, or if items were donated, make sure you have a list of your donors, the item that they donated and the approximate value, and perhaps take some pictures of those items as well. Now, a word on power imbalance. Sponsors should be mindful of the inherent power imbalance that exists simply because the newcomers are unfamiliar with living in Canada and because their financial needs are being met by their sponsors. There are some things that contribute to this power imbalance and some ways that can lessen the impact of power imbalance. So it's heightened when sponsors make decisions for the newcomers. Power imbalance is heightened. Or when they assume that a newcomer is incapable of making a decision or doing something on their own. It is also heightened when sponsors manage the newcomer's finances or when they drive them everywhere they need to go. So ways to reduce the power imbalance that the newcomer has is to provide them with the freedom of choice, the independent decision-making. That's what autonomy means. that they can make decisions independently, and that they have independence to do things on their own, that you're not always hand-holding them with everything. A good practice is to show them once, do it with them once, and then let them do it on their own. And power imbalance can be reduced, and it should be done as soon as possible by allowing them to self-manage their own finances. And to have the freedom to travel on their own if they wish to. So even though you may have a vehicle or enough people that are willing to drive them where they need to go, it is still your responsibility to teach them how to use the public transit system. And you still are required to provide them with monthly bus passes, even if they're being driven where they need to go. This allows them the freedom to travel on their own if they wish to. And you can reduce power imbalance by encouraging them to make community connections on their own apart from their sponsors, to make new friends and circles of support that are separate from their sponsors. And finally, a word on cultural intelligence. Sponsors should educate themselves regarding the cultural differences between themselves and the persons whom they are sponsoring. So are there any gestures or symbols or mannerisms that are different between the two cultures, the culture of Canada and the culture of the newcomer? Are there certain foods or religious practices, or perhaps there is a particular animal reverence that you need to be aware of? Are there any fears of domesticated animals that you need to be aware of? And is there a cultural center where you can get more information on the culture of the newcomer who is coming to Canada? That's it for my review. But quickly, the important dates coming up, March 19th. We will have you complete your quizzes for modules 5 through 8. On the 22nd of March at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll review those quizzes. And March 26th, the final exam is due. And of course, you need to make sure that you submit your final exam before 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, because your access will close. And your access time may be different if you're in a different time zone, but you will see your time that the exam closes on your computer when you open the final exam. The grade to pass is 60%. There are 50 questions with case scenarios, multiple choice, true or false, maybe some drag or drop as well. And we will review the final exam at 1 p.m. on the 29th of March.